Hey, it's Bilal, and this is Deep Sea, the podcast about seeing the world more deeply. Finally, we have a decade with a proper name, the 20s. The last decade was tough to name. I simply just called it the 2010s. And the one before was even more awkward. Us Brits called it the noughties, while Americans called it the aughts. Thankfully, the 20s now has a much nicer ring to it. With the new year, I think it's also interesting to see how we think about recent history and time. For example, when I was a kid, Reagan and Thatcher were the leaders, and I can remember that time today. However, when you ask kids today about those leaders, they scratch their heads often. And it kind of makes sense, because from a time perspective, they are the equivalent of mentioning Dwight Eisenhower and Harold Macmillan when we were kids. That's how far back Reagan and Thatcher are to them, as Eisenhower and Macmillan were to us when we were young. And remember when Jurassic Park, The Lion King and Forrest Gump came out in cinemas? Well, that now is closer to the moon landing than it is to today. And perhaps the most scary thought is that most of our children will live to see the 2100s, while we won't. Now, moving on from that morbid thought, perhaps one of the most common things people do in January is to make New Year's resolutions. You've had your big holiday meals and now it's time to shape up. And everyone returns back to work, deals are to be done, so it's time to set goals and make new plans. However, while I used to make New Year's resolutions, I no longer do. I have nothing against resolutions, but I do have a problem with the timing. The trouble for me is that January is still in the winter. I live in London, so the days, while they are getting slightly longer, they are still short. The weather is cold and the sky is grey, at least here in London. So I don't really find it a very inspiring time of the year from that perspective. For me, spring is actually the best time to set goals and to make resolutions. The seasons are changing, nature is coming out of its slumber, and the weather is much, much nicer. Indeed, many cultures have significant renewal events around springtime. Easter, perhaps, is the most famous one, but there are others too. And I'm not sure if it's a coincidence or not, but it's also the start of the tax year. So, while I have nothing against resolutions, I think one should make them in line with nature. In that way, you have everything working to help you feel inspired to keep them. The weather and sprouting flowers and such will keep you going. Therefore, there's no New Year's resolutions for me. Thanks for listening. Please tell a friend about the podcast. Leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever you go for your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @BilalHafiz123. You can also follow me on Facebook, LinkedIn, or on my blog, bilalhafiz.com. For my research work, you can go to macrohive.com. I'll be back soon, so tune in then.